This chapter is focusing on the Great West and the technology changes that came from that late 1800 period with industrialization. The first challenge that we have to face out west is the Native American issue once again. Earlier we had put them out on reservations, and now that land that we put them on is going to be desired by settlers moving out into the western area, and we need to figure out how to deal with them, and that's what's going to happen in this chapter. Is we're going to have to educate them, we're going to have to train them, and we're going to have to break down that reservation system that we had placed them on. The early attempts to pacify the Native Americans led to certain treaties, Fort Laramie, Fort Atkinson, but the problem with that was the government failed to uphold their bargains, and the more important issue is that Native Americans didn't recognize them, because you'd see here that the real authority was the family figure. We used the earlier example of the whiskey ring and the Indian ring from Ulysses S. Grant's presidency to talk about the corruptive behaviors of the agents that were in charge of those reservations and working with the Native Americans. And here we see that very issue. Not only were the agents corrupt, but also the Indian agents were corrupt. They were basically gypping their own people. We're going to see a number of battles take place between the Native Americans who are resisting the white government, and you're going to see Colonel Custer and some other violent massacres taking place by both sides. Make sure you understand that in that period. And it's a lot because of the value that the land holds, even though it was perceived to be unvalued or had no value. And here's an example where you find gold in the Black Hills. It's going to attract gold seekers to want to take over that land that the Sioux were at that time living on. We have Chief Joseph and Sitting Bull, two very important Native American leaders. Chief Joseph, who does surrender and says, "I shall fight no more." You've got them attempting to protect their Native American families, and a lot of them, like Chief Joseph, will try to flee to Canada, and on their trip they will be stopped by the U.S. Army. Even more interesting is, in that period, the impact on the environment, specifically the buffalo. They face almost near extermination. And we can see here, this represents a pile of bison bones. And that's just how we can visualize how much they were hunted and attacked, and not for the use of their body parts or use of the meat, but just by pure sport. And that was something that conflicted with the Native American view of nature and how they utilized every component of the animal when they made a kill. There are a number of responses to this Native American problem. We do see here some authors like Helen Hunt Jackson, who writes A Century of Dishonor, and it's basically about the 100 years that we had victimized and brutalized the Native Americans with treaty after treaty that's never upheld. And this is her example, A Century of Dishonor, Helen Hunt Jackson, and the Trail of Tears, going back to Andrew Jackson's time period to the current events that are happening at that time, like the butchering of Native Americans, both women, children, and elderly. As the government tries to deal with this problem, they need to begin thinking about incorporating the Native American into American government and American citizenship, and that's going to come with the Dawes Severalty Act that will eventually promise them citizenship later in 1924. And part of that would require first to train the Native American to become adapted with our culture, and they do that with the Carlisle School and the Indian Reorganization Act. The Carlisle School, as you can see here, was an attempt to take the children and teach them English, teach them culture, teach them how to assimilate and become white in essence. And that's the distinction here between the first lens of what they would look like and how they would look afterwards, proper and civilized. You'd also see here in this example, this represents a graduating class. They're in military uniforms because it was run by the military. And they would use strict codes. It would prevent them from practicing their languages. They would prevent them from speaking in their native tongues, all of which would culminate in the extermination of their heritage and culture. It would only be just recently that they've started to revive that culture and bring it back because the government actively sought to eliminate it. Furthermore, those lands out west, like the Comstock Lode, were yielding amazing amounts of gold and silver, all were very valuable and attracted more settlers. You'd get those lucky strikes, people who were drawn to those areas and would focus on pulling that out of the ground. You also have the beef barons, the long drive trying to get the cattle to the slaughterhouses, and how the railroad would actually help that but also destroy it. We talked about that in class when we looked at the impact of the railroads on the cattle farms. Those lands out west also had the increased challenge of not much rain, and that would lead to a new type of farming called dry farming, where it was much more shallower so that they wouldn't have to worry about the crop drying out. And obviously in the 1930s that leads to the Dust Bowl, where there's a lack of water and they're not able to get the necessary irrigation to their crops. While this is all happening out west, we also find some other people like Frederick Jackson Turner, who writes this expose about the frontier and how it's always important to us, and how it defines the opportunities that are present in American culture, the ability to make something of yourself, and he believes that frontier is closing. And in fact, it's closed by 1898, according to Jackson. And that's going to prompt the United States government to try and find that next frontier, which leads us into the next segment of American imperialism. Let's go outside of our borders and find those new frontiers that we can tap into in order to continue cultivating and creating that opportunity. That opportunity was the safety valve theory, where we needed that land so we can continue to let the people out of the east or out of the cities move into the middle of the country and populate those areas. However, the people in the cities were not very much attracted to farming. They were that unskilled labor force, they really weren't familiar with it, and that does pose some problems. We see Henry George, just a quick example of him. We talked about him in class, the single tax, the fact that the government needs to take a more active role in the economy in an effort to equalize the wealth because it was going into the hands of few. And that is going to lead to the rise of the Grange. Here they are here, a group of farmers who are trying to organize themselves in an effort to create legislation that will benefit them as a group, like subsidized farming, like having the government control the railroads. And here are some of their platforms, the Omaha platform. I'm going to leave this up for you. And as you can see, one of the first components here is they want unlimited coinage of silver. They said, let's get the inflated economy that will help people like the debtors make a living. Let's have a graduated income tax. The more you make, the more you pay. That again will help equalize the playing field. We want to have the government own and operate the railroad companies, a postal savings bank to deposit your monies and help facilitate it. This is the public necessity owning the railroad, workers owning the companies, the factories rather. That's all there in the Omaha platform. This Grange movement leads into the Populist Party, which that Omaha platform represents. And it's got some notorious leaders like Ignatius Donnelly, and we will see that William Jennings Bryan, also a known populist, made that gold speech, cross of gold speech that I had you look at. And though they're not successful, and you need to make that note, not successful, they are important in that they lay the groundwork for the progressive era that begins in 1900 under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt, who decides to make the presidency an agent for social reform. That's the key. And that's going to prompt a new era for the United States and begin a new century.